He wasn't born in a courtroom, standing tall and undefeated. He was born in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered at night, where sirens screamed louder than laughter, and where dreams often died before they had a chance to live. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, her hands rough from years of labor. His father, a ghost of a man he barely remembered, swallowed by the system before he could ever teach his son how to tie a tie. At night, he would sit beside his mother, watching courtroom dramas on their small, flickering television. The lawyers in their crisp suits, their voices filled with confidence, their presence commanding. He wanted to be one of them. He wanted to stand in a courtroom and fight, to be the man who changed lives. One evening, he turned to his mother and said, "I want to be a lawyer." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Baby, the world ain't built for men like you to stand in courtrooms." But he refused to believe that. He was 12 years old when he realized how cruel the world could be. His best friend, Malik, was walking home from the store, a bag of candy in his hand, when a police car pulled up beside him. 2 officers stepped out, their hands already resting on their belts. "Where'd you get that?" one officer asked. Malik swallowed hard. "I bought it." "With what money?" Before he could answer, they shoved him against the brick wall of the corner store. The candy spilled onto the pavement, bright red and yellow wrappers crushed under their boots. Across the street, he watched, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He wanted to do something, to say something, but he didn't. When they dragged Malik into the car and drove away, he ran home, breathless, confused, angry. His mother was at the stove stirring a pot of soup. "Mom!" he shouted. "They took Malik! He didn't do anything!" She sighed, turning off the burner. She had seen this happen too many times before. "Baby, sit down." "I don't want to sit down." His voice cracked with frustration. "They just took him. He didn't do anything, Mom. They didn't even ask questions." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, taking his hands in hers. "That's the way this world works, baby. They don't need a reason." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held years of exhaustion. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Malik's frightened face burned into his mind. That was the moment he knew. He wouldn't just watch anymore. He would fight back. School became his battlefield. Books became his weapons. He sat in the front row of every class, asked the most questions, wrote the longest essays. But no matter how hard he tried, he was always overlooked. One day, in his history class, he raised his hand to answer a question. The teacher ignored him, scanning the room for another student. He kept his hand up, determined, until she finally sighed and said, "Yes? Do you have a question?" "I have the answer," he said. The class snickered. The teacher rolled her eyes. "All right, let's hear it." He gave a detailed response, factually correct, well articulated. But instead of acknowledging him, she simply turned to another student. "Anyone else?" That was the first time he understood that being smart wasn't enough. He had to be undeniable. When he got accepted into college, it felt like the first real victory of his life. But the battle was far from over. He wanted to go to the best law school in the country. He spent weeks preparing his application, writing the perfect essay, gathering recommendations. And then the rejection letter came. "We regret to inform you." He stared at the words, numb. He had done everything right. He had earned it. But that didn't matter, did it? His mother found him sitting at the kitchen table, the letter crumpled in his hands. "One school said no," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "That doesn't mean they all will." He wiped his eyes and nodded. He wouldn't give up. He sent out more applications. More rejection letters followed. But then, one acceptance. It wasn't Harvard. It wasn't Yale. It wasn't a top-ranked law school, but it was a chance. And that was all he needed. From the first day of law school, he felt the weight of being the only black student in most of his classes. He sat in lecture halls filled with students whose fathers were judges, senators, CEOs. When they talked about their dreams, they spoke with certainty. They knew they belonged here. He wasn't so sure. He overheard whispers in the hallways. He probably got in through some diversity quota. Doubt he'll make it past first year. Why even try? Black lawyers never win. He studied harder than everyone else. He worked twice as hard, spoke twice as carefully, and yet, when the professors called on students to answer, they rarely picked him. One afternoon, during a class discussion, he raised his hand. The professor's gaze swept the room before finally landing on him. "You have something to say?" He nodded. "Yes, sir." "All right," the professor sighed. "Make it quick." He laid out his argument, sharp, precise, backed with legal precedent. When he finished, the professor nodded. "Interesting perspective," he said flatly. "Anyone else?" That was it. No acknowledgement, no further discussion. It was as if he had never spoken at all. But that only fueled him further. If they wouldn't listen, he'd make them. He spent hours in the library, memorizing case law, practicing his arguments. He knew that the only way to break the system was to master it. And when he finally stepped into a courtroom as a lawyer for the first time, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. Not just his clients, not just justice, but for every boy who had ever been ignored in a classroom, for every innocent person who had been thrown into the back of a police car, for every rejection letter that came with an unspoken message. You don't belong here. But he did. And he was about to prove it. He stepped into the courtroom for the first time as a lawyer, his heart pounding, but his face unreadable. The weight of every rejection, every injustice, every moment of being dismissed and overlooked sat on his shoulders. Yet as he adjusted his tie and approached the defense table, he knew that this moment was bigger than him. The judge barely spared him a glance, already deep in conversation with the prosecutor, an older white man who had been practicing law for decades. The prosecutor smirked as he looked over the case files, then turned to him. "First case?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He nodded. The prosecutor chuckled. "Hope you're ready to lose." He didn't respond. He had learned long ago that words meant nothing if you couldn't back them up. His client was a 16-year-old black boy accused of robbing a convenience store at gunpoint. The evidence was flimsy. Security footage that barely showed a clear face, a nervous store clerk who admitted he hadn't gotten a good look, and a lineup where the teenager had been the only black person among 5 suspects. Yet, the prosecution was confident. Confident because history had taught them that juries rarely hesitated when the defendant looked like his client. The trial began, and he presented his arguments carefully, methodically, just as he had practiced for years. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the witness statements, the lack of real evidence, the racial bias in the suspect lineup. The judge barely looked at him as he spoke. The jury, mostly white, sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. Then the prosecution began. The store clerk was called to the stand. "Are you sure this is the boy who robbed you?" the prosecutor asked. The clerk hesitated. I think so. But you're not 100% sure?" "Well, no, but," the prosecutor smiled, turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the store was robbed, a crime was committed, and here we have a young man who fits the description." That was all it took. No real proof. No definitive evidence. Just a feeling. He clenched his jaw, watching as the jury nodded slightly. They didn't need proof. The system had trained them to see guilt before they saw innocence. In his closing argument, he spoke from the heart. He reminded them that justice required certainty, that sending a 16-year-old to prison for a crime he likely didn't commit wasn't justice. It was a failure of the system. When the verdict came back, he already knew what it would be. Guilty!" The boy broke down in tears. His mother sobbed from the back of the courtroom. And he stood there, fists clenched at his sides, staring straight ahead, refusing to let them see the rage burning inside him. He had lost. But as he walked out of the courtroom that day, he knew one thing for certain. He would never lose like this again. His losses became his fuel. He took case after case, defending people who had no one else fighting for them. He studied harder, worked longer hours, pushed himself beyond exhaustion. He learned how the system worked, not how it claimed to work, but how it really operated behind closed doors. He saw how prosecutors manipulated juries, how judges dismissed key evidence, how laws were bent to protect the powerful and punish the poor. He saw how the color of a man's skin could decide his fate before a single word was spoken in court. And then one day, he found the case that would change everything. A wealthy white businessman had shot a black man on his own front porch. His defense? "I felt threatened." The police barely investigated. The media painted the victim as a troublemaker. The case should have been open and shut, but not this time. This time, the black lawyer stepped forward and took the case. The trial was unlike anything he had faced before. The businessman had money, influence, and the system on his side. The judge was known for being tough on black defendants. The jury selection process was rigged in the prosecution's favor, but he came prepared. In court, he ripped apart the defense's argument piece by piece. He presented evidence that showed the victim was unarmed, that the businessman had a history of making racist remarks, that the police had deliberately overlooked key details. Then, in his final statement, he asked just one question. If the roles were reversed, if a black man had shot a white man standing on his own porch, would we even be having this trial? The courtroom fell silent. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The prosecutor averted his eyes. For the first time, the system hesitated. When the verdict was announced, guilty, the courtroom erupted. This wasn't just a win. This was a message. He had cracked the system, forced it to look at itself, exposed its cracks to the world. Reporters swarmed him outside the courthouse, shoving microphones into his face. "You've just made history," one of them said. "How do you feel?" He thought for a moment before answering. Then, with quiet confidence, he said, "I'm not here to make history. I'm here to make sure no one else has to fight the battles I fought." And with that, he walked away. Not just a lawyer, a symbol of change. He had won, but the battle was far from over. His victory in court made headlines, but it also made enemies. The system didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone like him. The old guards of power, the ones who had spent decades shaping the laws to serve only a select few, saw him as a threat. They came after him. It started with whispers, judges suddenly becoming unavailable for his cases, potential clients mysteriously pulling away, anonymous threats left on his office voicemail. "You don't belong here. Stay in your place. You're playing a dangerous game." But he didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down, taking on even bigger cases, representing those who had been crushed by the system for years. He became the face of justice for the unheard, the defender of those who never had anyone to fight for them. And then the system struck back. One morning, he walked into his office only to find 2 federal agents waiting for him. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "We need you to come with us." He frowned. "What's this about?" "You're under investigation," the agent replied. "Serious allegations. It would be in your best interest to cooperate." He had seen this play before. This wasn't about justice. This was about silencing him. They wanted to tarnish his name, to dig up anything, real or fabricated, that could discredit him. He was becoming too powerful, too influential. The people he had defeated in court, the wealthy businessmen, the corrupt officials, the prosecutors who lost cases they had never expected to lose, had found another way to fight him. For months, he was dragged through hearings, interrogations, and media scrutiny. Headlines changed overnight. rising star attorney under federal investigation. Is he as clean as he claims? Justice warrior or just another corrupt lawyer? They wanted to break him, but what they didn't realize was that he had been fighting battles long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. Instead of hiding, he faced them head-on. Every false claim they made, he tore apart with facts. Every fabricated accusation, he countered with proof. He turned their own tactics against them, using the very law they had once wielded as a weapon to expose their corruption. And when the dust settled, when every lie had been dismantled and every accusation had crumbled under scrutiny, the verdict was clear. He was innocent. But something had changed. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He wasn't just a man fighting for justice. He was a movement. The day he walked free from that storm, the world was watching. His name was no longer just a name, it was a symbol. He had beaten the system twice. And now, he was more determined than ever. He no longer fought just for individual cases. He fought to change the law itself. He took on policies that had unfairly targeted black communities for decades. He pushed for criminal justice reform, advocating for fair trials, for equal representation, for the abolition of laws that had destroyed countless lives. And he didn't do it alone. His victories inspired others, black men and women who had once thought the law wasn't made for them, who had been told that their voices didn't matter, who had seen the system crush their fathers, their brothers, their friends. Now they were stepping forward. They were becoming lawyers, judges, lawmakers. Because of him, they believed. Years later, he stood once again in a courtroom, but this time, he wasn't defending a client. He was standing before the Supreme Court. His fight had led him here. The case he was arguing had the power to reshape legal history, to dismantle laws that had upheld inequality for generations. The justices listened carefully, their faces impassive. The courtroom was packed, cameras rolling, the entire nation waiting to see what would happen. And as he stood there, making his case, he realized something. He had once been a boy sitting in front of a flickering television, watching courtroom dramas, dreaming of standing in a place like this. Now he wasn't just standing in it, he was changing it. And no matter what the verdict was, one thing was certain. The system would never be the same again. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he refused to show it. He had been here before, standing in a room where decisions were made, where fates were sealed. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just fighting for one person. He was fighting for generations. The Supreme Court chamber was silent, every seat filled with lawmakers, journalists, and those who had spent their lives waiting for this moment. The case he was arguing wasn't just a case. It was a battle for justice that had been centuries in the making. The legal precedent he was challenging had been used to lock up innocent black men, to deny them fair trials, to keep power in the hands of those who had never had to fight for it. His opponent was a man who had spent his career defending the status quo, a high-powered attorney backed by billionaires, lobbyists, and old money. The kind of man who had never had to prove himself the way he had. The Chief Justice cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, you may proceed." He took a breath, steadied himself, and stepped forward. "Your Honors," he began, his voice strong, unwavering, "the case before you today is not just about one man, one law, or one ruling. It is about the fundamental promise of justice, justice that has for too long been denied to people who look like me." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but he continued. "For decades, we have been told that the law is blind, that justice is equal, but we all know that is not the truth. The law has not been blind. It has simply chosen not to see us. And that ends today." His words carried through the chamber, each syllable deliberate, each pause calculated. He laid out his argument with precision, dismantling every justification the opposition had built over the years. He presented cases, statistics, real lives that had been ruined by the system they were defending. He forced them to see the truth, the way he had forced juries to see it, the way he had forced judges to acknowledge it. For the first time in his life, the people in power were listening. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. The opposing attorney, shifting in his seat, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat before launching into his own argument. But the weight of the moment had shifted. The power in the room had changed. He had done what he came to do. The decision wouldn't come that day. It would take weeks, months even. The justices would deliberate, debate, and weigh every word, every precedent, every implication. But as he walked out of the Supreme Court that afternoon, stepping onto the marble steps where history had been made time and time again, he knew something with absolute certainty. No matter what the ruling was, he had already won. Because this wasn't just about one case. It was about the doors he had opened, the conversations he had forced, the change that had already begun. And when the decision finally came, when the highest court in the land ruled in his favor, striking down a law that had oppressed his people for generations, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of what he had always known. This was never about winning or losing. It was about making sure the next fight wouldn't have to happen at all. Years later, his name would be written in history books. His cases would be studied in law schools. Young black boys would look at his picture and see something they had never been allowed to see before, themselves in a place of power. And when he was asked how it felt to have done what so many thought was impossible, he always gave the same answer. I was never fighting to change the system. He would pause, letting the weight of his words settle. I was fighting to prove that we were never meant to be trapped by it in the first place. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he refused to show it. He had been here before, standing in a room where decisions were made, where fates were sealed. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just fighting for one person. He was fighting for generations. The Supreme Court chamber was silent, every seat filled with lawmakers, journalists, and those who had spent their lives waiting for this moment. The case he was arguing wasn't just a case. It was a battle for justice that had been centuries in the making. The legal precedent he was challenging had been used to lock up innocent black men, to deny them fair trials, to keep power in the hands of those who had never had to fight for it. His opponent was a man who had spent his career defending the status quo, a high-powered attorney backed by billionaires, lobbyists, and old money, the kind of man who had never had to prove himself the way he had. The Chief Justice cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, you may proceed." He took a breath, steadied himself, and stepped forward. "Your Honors," he began, his voice strong, unwavering, "the case before you today is not just about one man, one law, or one ruling. It is about the fundamental promise of justice, justice that has, for too long, been denied to people who look like me." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but he continued. "For decades, we have been told that the law is blind, that justice is equal. But we all know that is not the truth. The law has not been blind. It has simply chosen not to see us. And that ends today." His words carried through the chamber, each syllable deliberate, each pause calculated. He laid out his argument with precision, dismantling every justification the opposition had built over the years. He presented cases, statistics, real lives that had been ruined by the system they were defending. He forced them to see the truth, the way he had forced juries to see it, the way he had forced judges to acknowledge it. For the first time in his life, the people in power were listening. When he finished, there was a heavy silence. The opposing attorney, shifting in his seat, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat before launching into his own argument. But the weight of the moment had shifted. The power in the room had changed. He had done what he came to do. The decision wouldn't come that day. It would take weeks, months even. The justices would deliberate, debate, and weigh every word, every precedent, every implication. But as he walked out of the Supreme Court that afternoon, stepping onto the marble steps where history had been made time and time again, he knew something with absolute certainty. No matter what the ruling was, he had already won. Because this wasn't just about one case. It was about the doors he had opened, the conversations he had forced, the change that had already begun. And when the decision finally came, when the highest court in the land ruled in his favor, striking down a law that had oppressed his people for generations, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of what he had always known. This was never about winning or losing. It was about making sure the next fight wouldn't have to happen at all. Years later, his name would be written in history books. His cases would be studied in law schools. Young black boys would look at his picture and see something they had never been allowed to see before, themselves in a place of power. And when he was asked how it felt to have done what so many thought was impossible, he always gave the same answer. "I was never fighting to change the system." He would pause, letting the weight of his words settle. "I was fighting to prove that we were never meant to be trapped by it in the first place." Years passed, but the fire inside him never dimmed. Victory in the Supreme Court had cemented his name in legal history, but he knew better than anyone that a single ruling couldn't erase centuries of injustice. Laws could change, but mindsets took longer. Systems adapted. The fight was never truly over. He had won battles, but the war was still being fought in courtrooms across the country, in schools where children of color were still told they weren't good enough, in prisons filled with young men who had been denied a second chance. He had spent years dismantling the walls that had been built to keep people like him out. But now, he had a different mission. He no longer wanted to fight the system. He wanted to build a new one. The call came on an autumn morning. He was in his office going through case files when his secretary knocked softly and entered. "You should turn on the news," she said. He frowned but reached for the remote. The screen flickered on, showing a packed press conference. A familiar voice filled the room. It was the governor. "In these times of change, we need someone who understands justice, not just as a word, but as a duty. Someone who has proven, time and time again, that they will fight for fairness, for integrity, for all people. That is why I am nominating—" His name echoed through the room. He froze. Nominating him. For Attorney General. He leaned back in his chair, stunned. The offer was everything he had worked for, the highest legal office in the state, the power to not just argue cases but to create real, lasting change. But power came with a price. His victories had made him a hero to many, but to others, he was still a threat. There were people who had spent their lives ensuring that men like him never reached places like this, and they wouldn't sit by and let it happen. His phone buzzed. It was his mother. He answered, his voice steady. "Mama?" "I just saw," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They want you to take the job." He hesitated. "I don't know if I should." She exhaled sharply. "Baby, your whole life has been about proving to them that you deserve a seat at the table. Now they're offering you the whole damn courtroom. You take it." He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not that simple." "It never is," she said softly. "But if not you, then who?" The words lingered in the air long after she had hung up. If not him, then who? That night, he walked the streets of his old neighborhood, letting the past settle over him like a familiar weight. The corner store where Malik had been arrested, the school where teachers had looked past him, the sidewalks where he had once been just another black kid with no future. The world had tried to decide his story before he had a chance to write it himself. But here he was, still writing. 2 weeks later, he stood before a packed crowd as the governor placed a hand on his shoulder. Cameras flashed, voices murmured, and he took the podium. He looked out over the faces before him. Judges, lawyers, politicians, reporters, people who had doubted him, people who had fought him, people who had once whispered that black lawyers never win. He adjusted his tie, took a breath, and spoke. For too long, justice has been something people hoped for instead of something they could rely on. That changes today. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was the law. And now, the system had no choice but to listen. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he had carried heavier burdens before. As the cameras flashed and the reporters scribbled notes, he stood before the crowd, looking out at the faces, some filled with pride, some with doubt, and some with quiet resentment. He knew what they were thinking. A black man as Attorney General, the same man who had spent years tearing apart their carefully built system. The same man who had forced courts to look in the mirror and confront the uncomfortable truth. Now, he was the one in charge. For a long time, the system had dictated his path. Today, he would dictate the system's. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and leaned toward the microphone. "I stand before you today not just as the Attorney General," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "I stand here as proof of what happens when justice is pursued, not given. When the fight is not just for the law, but for what is right. For too long, our courts have been a place of fear for some and protection for others. That ends now." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some clapped. Others simply watched, arms crossed, waiting to see if he was really the man he claimed to be. He didn't care about their skepticism. He had spent his whole life proving himself. Over the next few weeks, his office was flooded with cases. Some were high-profile, others were buried deep beneath years of bureaucracy. He knew where to begin. The first reform he pushed was criminal justice. He reviewed the files of men and women who had been incarcerated under mandatory minimum sentencing laws that had disproportionately punished black and brown communities for decades. Some of them had been given 20, 30-year sentences for crimes that wealthier white defendants had walked away from with probation. He launched an independent review board to re-examine these cases, and within months, he had successfully overturned dozens of wrongful convictions. But change didn't come without resistance. The old guards of power fought him at every step. They called him reckless. They accused him of weakening law enforcement. They tried to discredit him, to undermine every decision he made. One morning, he arrived at his office to find a newspaper on his desk. The headline read, "Attorney General Carter's Radical Reforms. Too much, too soon." He smirked, shaking his head. He had expected worse. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave his office, his phone rang. "Sir, you need to see this," his chief of staff said, his voice tight with concern. A news broadcast played on the screen. An anonymous whistleblower had leaked internal documents exposing corruption in the highest levels of state politics. Police departments had been fabricating evidence, judges had been taking bribes, and black communities had been targeted for arrests to fill private prisons for profit. It was a scandal that could shake the entire legal system to its core. And now, as Attorney General, it was his fight to lead. He sat in his chair, fingers steepled, the weight of the truth heavy in the air. They had always said the system was too big to change. But that was before it had to answer to him. The real battle had just begun.